Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We have a few folks who are still joining us, so we'll get started in just a few moments. Welcome all. We do still have a few more folks being admitted by Zoom. That happens pretty quickly per each user, but we're going to just give folks a few more seconds to make sure everyone is in and ready to go. All right, well, welcome again. My name is Erin Lurie, and I am the head of adult audiences at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. We are so pleased to be welcomed into your homes this afternoon. This is our second of our virtual Orchid Month celebrations. We celebrate Orchid Month in March because this is when the largest variety of orchids are in bloom. Our greenhouses are absolutely stunning right now, overflowing with blooms. I'm so glad we can gather virtually, and I hope that those of you who are in the DC area will visit the greenhouses in person. We do currently require advanced reservations and timed tickets, in addition to masks and social distancing to help make sure that we're managing a safe capacity. Drew Asbury is going to be guiding us through Orchid 101 today, and he's going to shed a little bit more about why orchids are a special fit here at Hillwood because of our founder, Marjorie Merriweather Post. Drew joined Hillwood in 2012, and he is currently the horticulturalist and volunteer manager. He's responsible for the greenhouses, the cutting garden, and our horticulture volunteer program. As we go along today, please submit your questions through the Q&A module that's located at the bottom. You'll see there's the one chat bubble for the chat and a pair of little speech bubbles for that Q&A. That's the best place to submit your questions in that Q&A section, and I can make sure that we get those asked of Drew as we go along. So with that, it is now my pleasure to turn us over to Drew.
Well, thank you, Erin, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Drew Asbury, and it's my pleasure to be here to speak to you today about growing orchids. So here's our agenda for today's program. We're going to start off with just a little introduction about Hillwood's collection, and then we're going to dive right into talking about the orchid family. We're going to make some broad generalizations at first, as well as looking at a bit of terminology that's useful for our discussion today. And then we will look right into those cultural requirements, which are all the little things we need to think about growing our orchids successfully at home. And of course, we'll be providing tips for reblooming the orchids all along the ways. But really, just to say it right up here front and forward, it's really all about those 7 cultural requirements, and playing with those is what's going to help you get your orchid to rebloom. And then we'll spend just a moment looking at repotting, talking about common pests and diseases of orchids. And then at the end, we will have time for questions and answers. So sit back and relax for a bit here. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with us here at Hillwood, we are located in Washington, DC, and we are the former home of Marjorie Merriweather Post, who created Hillwood to not only live here at, but to act as her lasting legacy, and one to be shared and enjoyed by the public. So visitors to the museum will not only get to see how Marjorie Post lived and get to see her kitchen and living room and her pink bathroom, but also visitors will get to see her collections of 18th century French decorative arts and Russian imperial art. And as for the outdoor areas, we are a 25-acre property nestled amongst the hills of Rock Creek Park, 12 acres of which are maintained garden spaces, many of which are laid out as a series of garden rooms. But yet today, we are going to explore off to this side of the property here. We're going to look at the greenhouse, which were not necessarily part of the formal gardens during the time of Marjorie Post, because these were over on the service area, the working side of the property. So what is our visitor center today was actually the head gardener's house. Our library today was the chauffeur's house. Off in the distance here, we had the butler's house, staff dormitories, garages and workshop spaces, and our cutting garden and greenhouse were also part of this service side because they were the working part of the gardens. And so while the greenhouses were not necessarily off limits to visitors during the days of Marjorie Post, they weren't generally on that official garden tour. So her collection rather would be grown out in the greenhouse. And then when things came into bloom, such as these Cymbidiums here on the left, orchids that were in bloom would be brought inside the house for her visitors and for Marjorie Post to enjoy. And so here we can see during her time at Hillwood, Marjorie Post amassed a collection of nearly 2,000 orchids. And here we can see a display of Cattleyas and Dendrobium and Phalaenopsis right here in the mansion's entry hall. And these displays would have been one of the very first thing that visitors would have seen as they first entered into the home. And here's proof that Marjorie Post traveled with orchids. Here she is seen at Camp Topridge, which was her summer home in upstate New York. This picture was taken in September of 1968, and it shows here this lovely arrangement of Vanda orchids. And most likely, these orchids would have been grown here at Hillwood in the greenhouse and then shuttled up to Camp Topridge so that everyone there, including Marjorie, could enjoy them while they were in bloom. But it was surely her breakfast room inside the home where the largest orchid displays were certainly the most extravagant. And here we can see some massive Cattleya specimens in the bay windows here. And the fragrance in this room must have been just absolutely intoxicating and surely overwhelming for some. But I think it's a clear indication that Marjorie Post must have absolutely loved the fragrance of Cattleyas. And there is no doubt in my mind that a room with this many Cattleyas, this would have permeated through much of the downstairs of the house. Amazingly fragrance. But we can also see here a little excerpt from her will where she left a request that stated that the greenhouses should be maintained at a level characteristic of the signing of this document for the benefit of the museum and the grounds of Hillwood exclusively, and that fresh flowers are to be kept in Hillwood at all times, as had been true in the decade 1957 to 1967. So this is just one of the very many traditions that we carry on today. This is a photo of that same little breakfast room taken about a month ago. And here we can see in the center, there's the Phalaenopsis orchids, and then off to the side here are amaryllis flowers. And also up in her bedroom at her fireplace mantle, we do our best to always keep a little vase with a fresh cut orchid in it. As you can see here in her portrait, she's holding onto a Cattleya. So we do our best to make it a Cattleya flower. And that was Marjorie Post's favorite flower of all, was the Cattleya. And so here's the greenhouse today. And we can see here, based on these two inventories that were taken about 40 years apart, that we have a very similar size collection today as we did back in the days of Marjorie Post. And I would argue that today our collection's a bit more diverse, and we're constantly adding new orchids that bloom in seasons other than spring. And we'll talk about why so many are blooming right now. We will talk about that later today. But yet we want to have flowers for visitors to enjoy every day of the year. So that's one of our goals, to diversify the bloom seasons. And then another strategic goal of the collection, and particularly of our orchid specialist, Andrew Beatenball, who manages the daily affairs of the collection, what we're trying to do is reintroduce many of the Cattleya species and cultivars that were present during the days of Marjorie Post. And we're using this 1975 inventory as kind of our goal of trying to get back some of these original orchids into the collection. And so one of the biggest differences, though, today with the greenhouses is that these days Hillwood has about 75,000 visitors a year. So while we still keep a few orchids inside the house at all times, the vast majority of the plants and the orchid displays are out in the greenhouses. And when visitors first enter into the greenhouse, they'll notice that the greenhouses are actually broken up into 5 distinct smaller greenhouses. And this allows us to grow a wider array of orchids because now we have 5 distinct environments that we can adjust and create different habitats in by adjusting the temperature and the lighting and the watering and such like that. These greenhouses are still considered working greenhouses, just in the day of Marjorie Post. Their purpose here is to grow an orchid collection, and every single orchid that we have in our collection is out and about for visitors to enjoy and see every day of the year. And visitors will also be entertained and see a lot of tropical plants mixed in with those orchids, many of which of those tropical plants will spend the summer outside, and then everybody goes inside during the winter time and becomes a nice little sanctuary to hide away inside the middle of winter. So let's move on and let's start talking about actually how we're going to care for our orchids, okay? And so the first big statement I think that needs to be said is that our entire collection here at Hillwood, and the ones we're going to talk about today, are all from tropical regions of the world. But with that said, orchids are extremely diverse and can be found in virtually every habitat on the planet, with the exception of glaciers and the oceans. So besides tropical rainforests, orchids are growing in deserts, they're growing in swamps and marshes, they grow in the frozen tundra, and even here in the mid-Atlantic, we have over 50 species of orchids that are native to right here. They basically blend in with our woodland and our natural areas and with our spring woodland ephemerals. And I think it's partly because of this immense diversity in habitat why orchids are often unfairly labeled as tricky or hard to grow. But yet the ultimate goal in growing an orchid, right? We're growing orchids because we want them to bloom, right? We want to enjoy the blooms. But in order to get an orchid to bloom, first we have to grow a happy, healthy plant. And the best way to grow a happy, healthy plant is to do our best to recreate that plant's natural environment and where it's growing in its natural habitat. So for us today, again, we're only going to talk about tropical orchids because those are the ones that are best to attempt to recreate their habitat inside our homes. And so the vast majority of these orchids that do come from tropical regions grow as epiphytes, okay? And this type of growth habit has major implications for how we're going to take that plant out of nature and try to grow it inside our homes. So for a moment, let's look at this picture down here. This is the Phalaenopsis growing out of nature. The Phalaenopsis is the most common orchid available. It's one of the best ones for beginners. This is the one you see at every grocery store, often called the moth orchid. But here you can see this is how it grows in nature. And if we imagine for a second our life there as that Phalaenopsis, you know, look at those roots. They're completely exposed to the elements, to the sunlight, to the wind, and to the rain. When it does rain, we get drenched on, but as soon as that rain stops, all that excess rainwater just flushes away, and you know, our roots dry out pretty quickly again, right? So the takeaway here is that in order to grow an epiphyte well, we need to maximize the air around the roots and this really quick, swift drainage around the roots, right? So, and we want to try to replicate these natural cycles in nature where the plant gets wet and dry as quickly as we can turn that over, because that's what's happening in nature, okay? So how do we recreate this in homes? Well, we can grow them on bark like this. This is one we were doing here at Hillwood. And at first you have to tie it on there with string, but eventually when new roots come out and grow, those roots will grip onto that plant or grip onto that bark there, and it will spend its whole life on that piece of wood. But this tends to be a little messy in our homes. So the vast majority of us put our orchids into containers. So rule number one, container absolutely has to have a drainage hole, okay? We need to have good drainage in our pot. And then secondly, here at Hillwood, this is the potting media that we put our orchids, particularly our Phalaenopsis, this is what they're planted in. So if you imagine for a moment filling this clay pot with this chunky media, and then if you were to take that to the sink and pour some water in there, you can imagine how quickly that water just flushes through that pot and drains through the bottom, okay? But yet that bark won't stay like that forever. And after a couple of years, what starts happening is that bark starts staying moist longer. It starts to break down a little bit and starts turning into maybe a little bit more of what we might think of as soil. All those little pockets of air that we see start to collapse, you know, as that soil starts to soil a little bit and sour. So this is why orchids, especially epiphytic orchids, every few years, they need to be repotted into a fresh media. So you're simply taking that plant out of the pot, removing all that old soil media that's starting to break down, and often you're putting that plant right back into the same size pot, filling back in with nice chunky media. And again, what we're trying to do is recreate that nice, fresh, airy media with really good drainage around the roots. Okay, so we'll talk more about this as we go. And then here are, several adaptations of life living as an epiphyte here. So we have pseudobulbs, fleshy leaves, and velamin. And what all of these three concepts are doing is that they are capturing and storing water. So again, imagine yourself living up in the treetops. Maybe for one reason or another, the rain's not so, plentiful. So you better devise a way to store some water. Okay, so on the left there are pseudobulbs. That's a very common technique in the world of orchids. Many orchids have pseudobulbs, and it's a sign that that orchid has evolved in a climate. Again, well, maybe there's a periodic dry period, or maybe it's just, maybe the rains aren't so regular, right? So that plant has is storing water there to use during dry times, okay? And now in the middle, we're looking at a Phalaenopsis here. And they're a bit more of an exception in the orchid world in the fact that they do not have pseudobulbs because they've evolved in a climate that has fairly regular moisture year round, okay? So whereas they don't necessarily have a pseudobulb, they do have thick fleshy leaves which are able to store a lot of water, okay? Compared to a really thin leaf is a plant that would quickly get desiccated when its roots were dry. But that thicker leaf allows it to withstand some periods of dryness. And then the last term we'll look at here is velamin. And this plant is really lovely. And those, what looks like roots there, you're actually looking at velamin. And velamin is a sponge-like layer that wraps around the official true root. And it acts like a sponge, just like the sponge in your kitchen sink. When it rains, that sponge fills up with water. And then when it stops raining, the root that's inside that velamin layer can slowly suck in that moisture and transport it up into the rest of the plant. So the takeaway here is that even if you don't know what kind of orchid you have, the structure of the plant itself is often giving you very good clues about how we should take care of that plant. And so another way we can describe an orchid is by its growth habit. And here we're going to look at monopodial orchids and sympodial orchids. And while these terms might not necessarily help us figure out exactly how to care for our orchid, it does tell us exactly where we should expect new leaves to come from, where new shoots come from, where new roots come from, and most importantly, where our flowers are going to originate from on that plant. Okay, so we'll look at monopodial first. Monopodials have one growing point, which is up here at the top of what is considered a modified stem. Okay, so each year, new leaves are going to come out at the top of a monopodial orchid, and then the roots and the flower spikes emerge from between those leaf sheets and gradually will move up the stem as that plant gets taller and taller and taller, okay? Now, a sympodial orchid is more similar to many of our perennials out in our garden. So if we think of how an iris or a daylily grows, they eventually become clumps, okay? And so this is because each year they put out a certain amount of new growths which originate from a creeping rhizome that creeps right along the soil surface, okay? And so here we can see two new shoots or growths coming off this dendrobium, which are originating from a little creeping rhizome down here on the ground. And so what we're going to look for is we allow this growth to grow over the course of a season, and that's what's going to bloom. Most times, there's always exceptions. We're being really generalized today, but for sympodial orchids, most of the time, that growth will grow over a course of one season, and then it blooms, right? And then it will not bloom again for the most part, okay? And so we can look at, we can find blooms on a sympodial orchid either coming out of the very center at the top. They sometimes bloom along the canes, as in the case of this dendrobium, or in the case of this cymbidium, that flower spike is coming out of the base of last year's growth, right? So this is going to come up. This growth is now done and will never bloom again, but yet all of its energy is going to help create some new growths for the next year to come up and bloom. Okay, so now that we've looked at some of these terms, let's put some of these terms into action here as we go through a tour of Hillwood's orchid collection. And we'll start here with the Phalaenopsis. Again, this is the moth orchid, the grocery store orchid. It's a great one for beginners, so highly recommend. But again, we want to first replicate that plant's natural environment, right? Well, phals are native to Southeast Asia, where they grow in warm to hot tropical rainforests, which generally have fairly regular moisture year-round, right? So they grow as epiphytes, implying that they're growing up in the treetops. They have a monopodial growth habit, and they lack pseudobulbs, okay? So since they don't need pseudobulbs, again, because they're growing in this environment that has fairly regular moisture, right? And therefore, these plants want fairly regular moisture in our homes as well. And we're going to talk more about the Phalaenopsis here after a little while. But let's move on to our next group, which are the Cattleyas. Okay, this was Marjorie Post's favorite orchid. These are often known as the Cressage Orchid, and they're known for their intense fragrance and a wide variety of colors and shapes and forms. They are also considered warm growers like the Phalaenopsis, but these are native to warm regions of Central and South America. Okay. Cattleyas are also epiphytes, so they're growing up in the treetops and they want all this good air and drainage around their roots. But yet, unlike a Phalaenopsis, they have a sympodial growth habit. So these will become clumps that eventually get bigger and bigger and bigger. And also, unlike the Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas have very distinctive pseudobulbs, and thus they're storing water, right? And this implies that the moisture in their native habitat isn't quite as regular as the habitat of Phalaenopsis grows in, right? So they've evolved to store some of that water, right? So the takeaway here is that, you know, again, if you have pseudobulbs, you definitely want to make sure your plants dry down between waterings almost completely. And pseudobulbs are also a good sign that your plant may require a much more strict dormancy, where there's periods of the year where it might not get any water. Okay, so for us, certainly we slow down our watering on Cattleyas during the winter time, and it's certainly less watering than we water during the summer. But we'll talk more about that again too in a little while here. And so even though I just called all of those pictures on the last slide Cattleyas, a better description really would have been that they were all members of the Cattleya Alliance. Okay, and that's because there's a whole group of hundreds of closely related genera and species that are genetically close enough to hybridize with one another. So here's an example. Here on the left is a Brassivola and a Cattleya. Those are genetically close enough that they can be hybridized together, and the resulting progeny turns into something like this, right? And this would be called a Brasso-Cattleya, okay? And then what orchid growers will do, and sometimes this happens in nature, but this is more man getting in there and playing around with orchids, is you could take this Brasso-Cattleya and you could hybridize it with a Laelia, which is another one of these Cattleya Alliance members, and then you end up with a Brasso-Laelia Cattleya. So you can see how complicated the parentage and lineage can get, and this is why there's hundreds of thousands of hybrids of orchids. But yet, even though there's some variation in their habitat, here at Hillwood, we treat all of the Cattleya Alliance basically the same. They're considered warm-loving orchids and high-light orchids. And then our last warm-loving orchids that we'll look at today are the Vandas. These are also from tropical Asia and require the highest amount of light in our entire collection, almost full sun during the winter time, maybe just a tiny bit of shading full sun during the winter, slight shading during the summertime. And here you can see them hanging in the greenhouse. There's absolutely no soil media or bark or anything around these plants, but yet they have these huge root systems that dangle in the air. And these are ones that we will either mist or water almost every day. So they are considered monopodial. They do not have pseudobulbs, and they often have these massive root systems that are just covered in a really thick layer of velamin, which is their way of really absorbing any little bit of moisture from the air and then transporting it up into the plant. And so now we'll move on to our intermediate greenhouse. This is kept just slightly cooler than our warm growing greenhouses. So in the middle of winter, we're maybe down in the upper 50s to low 60s. And here we see members of the Oncidium Alliance. These are often considered or called the dancing ladies or the spider orchids. Again, these are another group of very closely related genera that can all hybridize with one another. And so just like Cattleyas, these are also from Central and South America. They are also epiphytes. They have a sympodial growth habit, and they have pseudobulbs. So that's the same descriptors that we use for Cattleyas, okay? We can start making some similarities between the different orchids. So now we're on to our slipper orchids, which are the Paphiopedilums and Phragmopedilums. And these are our first terrestrial orchid, what we've seen today. So terrestrial orchids are kind of the opposite of an epiphytic orchid. Terrestrial orchids grow in the ground as opposed to growing up in the treetops. So what this means is that, terrestrial orchids, but yet I'll back up, the ground in a tropical rainforest might not be quite the same type of soil that we're planting our tomatoes in our backyard. It's going to be a little bit chunkier. Maybe there's branches and twigs. But yet what it clearly is that if your roots are growing in the ground, you certainly like more moisture than if your roots are attached to the side of a tree. Okay, so terrestrial orchids tend to like a little bit more moisture than epiphytic orchids. Paphiopedilums have a sympodial type growth habit, which means they do turn into little clumps over time. And lastly, they do not have pseudobulbs. So yet, now we have a terrestrial orchid without pseudobulbs, and you also have fairly thin leaves, okay? So that's 3 indications that that plant is gonna like more moisture than the typical orchid, okay? So slipper orchids tend to be moisture loving. And then, there's so many oddities in the house, and this is just a few from our intermediate greenhouse. Here on the left is Ludesia, often grown for this lovely dark velvety foliage here. The Dendrobiums are the chain orchids with 12 to 18-inch long pendulous flower spikes. One of my absolute favorites are the Stanhopias. And these are by far, I believe, the absolute most fragrant of all of the orchids in the greenhouse, but they're big plants. This is one in the background. We have to grow these plants in moss baskets because their spikes actually shoot downwards. And here you can see the spike originating from this pseudobulb, and it's pendulous, right? So not one to put in a clay pot. It needs a moss basket. And then lastly, over here on the right is actually our vanilla vine. So that same vanilla extract that you have in your kitchen originated from the vanilla plant, which is a tropical orchid. It grows as a rambling vine in nature, but then it flowers, and then that flower, if it fruits, will become that little vanilla pod or bean, I suppose. And then we'll move on to our first cool-loving orchid here. These are the Cymbidiums, and these plants are also terrestrial or semi-terrestrial, yet they have very large pseudobulbs, okay? So this is because Cymbidiums have originated in a part of the world where there's a wet season and a dry season, okay? So during that wet or monsoon season, these plants love moisture, love a lot of it, and they grow very quickly. But then during the dry season, they might go virtually months and months without a single drop of water. And that's why those pseudobulbs are there for those dry periods, okay? Cymbidiums have a sympodial growth. They become very large over time. A large cymbidium can easily be 3 to 4 feet tall and wide, and will be some of the largest orchids in our collection once mature. And so besides growing in a region where there's a wet and a dry season, they also like temperatures in the winter where it's downright chilly. Okay, so these want temperatures in the 40s and 50s at night. So if Cymbidiums did not receive both a very dry period of the year or these cold conditions for part of the year, they might grow beautiful green foliage, but they would never bloom. Okay, again, the whole goal of getting an orchid to bloom is replicating its natural environment. And for these, they want cold and dry in the winter and cool and moist in the summer. And then our last group here are the Dendrobiums. This is one of the largest genera of all of the orchid family. There's over 1,500 species of Dendrobiums alone. Here we have them growing in our cold house, our intermediate house, and our warm house because of their diversity of habitats. All of the ones pictured here are epiphytes. They grow a sympodial growth habit. They all have pseudobulbs in the form of canes. But again, all these plants are giving us clues about how we're going to take care of these plants. And if you're ever out to dinner and you get on your plate an orchid or a little flower, this could very well be, it's this Dendrobium here is most likely the flower you have on your dinner plate. So, we've talked a lot about these cultural conditions already about many of the orchids in our collection, but now we're going to get into more specific and actually look at each one of these cultural requirements individually. The truth is that it is these 7 cultural requirements that are the game that orchid players play, right? And yet all 7 of these are interconnected and associated with one another. And changing in one will affect changes in the other, okay? So, but luckily, plants are adaptable. They want to survive. Orchids want to bloom, I promise. And this is why growing orchids is so addictive and so experimental, right? And this is also why every orchid grower will have a different opinion on how best to achieve, maximum orchid growth and blooming, right? So today, this is just one grower's opinion. It's just my opinion. There's many ways that you can grow an orchid with satisfactory results. But for the rest of our talk today, as we go through these cultural requirements, we're going to compare and contrast the Phalaenopsis with the Cattleya, because once you learn how to grow both of these, then it's very easy to grow all those other orchids we looked at. So like the Oncidiums, you can be like, well, they grow just like a Cattleya, but maybe slightly less light. Or a lady slipper grows very similar to a Phalaenopsis. So if you've had a Phalaenopsis bloom for you, you can almost purchase a lady slipper and grow it right next to it with the same care. And you probably have a pretty good chance of having good luck with that too. Okay. But yet, so, here's this, our most complicated chart of the day. But I believe this is the easiest way to see how all of these cultural requirements are interconnected, and most particularly how those cultural conditions change over the course of 1 year. Okay, so what we're talking about here is the orchid annual cycle. And that's because every single orchid, including our Phalaenopsis and our Cattleya, they grow on a 1-year annual cycle. And this implies that each and every year, there's only a certain time of the year where that plant's going to grow a new leaf or a new pseudobulb. There's a certain time of the year it grows new roots. There's a certain time of the year it rests and just kind of chills out for a little while. And then there's another certain time of the year where it initiates flowers and comes into bloom, okay? And then once your orchid gets onto a cycle like this, these same things will happen at the same time every single year, okay? And so the major takeaway here is that your orchid should bloom once a year. And it's the exception for an orchid to bloom more than once a year. And I don't know of any orchids that bloom every 3rd year. So it's once a year. And if you missed it on this cycle, you basically have to wait till the whole cycle goes around to that proper moment again, right? And how to tell it where to be on the cycle? Well, that's where the watering and your light and the temperature you give it, those are the 3 main cultural requirements that really help that plant figure out where it should be on the cycle, when it should grow leaves, when it should bloom, and so forth, okay? And so I think it comes to nobody's surprise that, it's very easy to grow and bloom orchids in the greenhouse, right? But why exactly is that? It's not necessarily just because during the summer months, it's lovely and it's hot and humid and feels like a tropical rainforest. Like that definitely helps. But yet it's over the course of an entire year, how drastically different that environment in the greenhouse is. So for instance, during the warm months of the year, that greenhouse is downright hot. We have really long hours of day length, right? Because the greenhouse is, we don't have lights in there. So it's all based on sunlight. So we have really long days, we have hot temperatures, and because of that, we have to water more often, okay? And then compared to the cold months of the year, where there's cooler temperatures, the greenhouses are cool, we have to run heat, right, to even just keep them at a minimum. There's less hours of daylight. And then because of that, we're watering less, okay? So all 3 of those things is what, that's our job as orchid growers, right? Is providing these subtle changes in the environment over the course of an entire year. And hopefully all of our efforts will be rewarded at that one part of the cycle where the plant is going to bloom, okay? So the worst thing to do to try to grow your orchid is to grow your orchid in a static environment. And so I often think of like an office building as the static environment, right? That's where if you kept the temperature at 72 degrees day and night year round, maybe it's all done by artificial light that's on at 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day, year round, right? And because it's getting the same amount of temperature and the same amount of light, well, you're probably watering it the same, right? So that's a perfect scenario where you're going to have this gorgeous green plant with beautiful green foliage, but it never, ever blooms, okay? So luckily, there's all types of tips and tricks that we can share here today to help induce that bloom and to get your plant on the annual cycle. But buyer beware, there are gimmicks everywhere in this world, including in the orchid world. So here on the left, we have dyed orchids. These were white Phalaenopsis that were injected with a dye as they were coming up and coming into bloom. So, you know, this is fine if you like this, you're welcome to purchase these, but yet the next time it blooms, they will be white. We often see out in the store, you know, they're being sold in glass fish bowls without a drainage hose. They come with silly instructions like just add ice. It's just that simple. No, it's not just that simple. So ignore silly instructions. And lastly, it may take your orchid an entire year once you get it home to get onto the proper cycle of your home, because who knows where that plant was grown and how it was forced into bloom. And these are mass produced and forced into bloom every day of the year. So if you bought one in, let's say, July and August, that's not the normal time for an orchid to bloom. So you're probably going to have to wait a year and a half in order for that plant to bloom again, okay? And so when you're shopping, also be aware of how long they've been in the store. I wouldn't buy any of these here because they're all bloomed out. I want to buy one that has one open flower and a whole chain of buds. Don't buy on hot or cold days. And when you get it in the car, go straight home. Because the very first thing, you know, if you have massive temperature swings of too cold or too hot, the first thing that plant's going to do is all those little flower buds are going to start to soften up, turn brown, and they're going to drop off, right? So, you know, beware. But anyway, let's get on to our techniques here. So watering, the most frequently asked question at Hillwood is how often do I water my orchid? And this is not an easy question to answer. Once a week is what we often say if we just only have a moment. But really, this all depends on, you know, what season is it? How much light does that orchid get? You know, what type of orchid is it? You know, what temperature is it growing in? What type of media is it growing in? How old is that media? You know, if it's growing in bark like this down here and it's fairly fresh bark, well, probably once a week is an appropriate answer. But if it's growing in sphagnum moss, which is what most of the Phalaenopsis in the grocery store are growing in, well, that's probably more like once every 2 weeks, okay? So it all depends. A better answer is to talk about proper watering technique. Let's just hang up that phone. So proper watering technique. So this is what I do at home. Here is my sink in my kitchen. I literally just take all of my orchids to the sink. They all have a drainage hole in that pot. I take that shower attachment and I thoroughly soak everything. Foliage, I'll try to avoid blooms if I can, but you cannot overwater at any given moment. Thoroughly soak that plant, allow it to drip there for a little while and drain, and then you put it back into its location, okay? Summer months, when we have warmer temperatures, more day length, more water. Colder months, less temperature, less day length, less water, okay? And again, remember, Phalaenopsis come from tropical regions of the world with fairly regular moisture. They have no Pseudobulbs, so they're going to need fairly regular watering year round. I still dry down a little, I spread out that watering a little bit during the winter time. And, you know, but between thorough waterings, they still want to dry down because they are an epiphyte, okay? Cattleyas, on the other hand, have those Pseudobulbs, right? So these want to be watered with the same technique, a thorough soaking, but then definitely allowed to dry out. You know, if you've got Pseudobulbs, you definitely are accustomed to going dry between those thorough waterings. And then particularly during the winter time, you certainly want to let those dry down a little bit. And then lastly, just ignore the ice cube method. There's this theory out there, you put 1 or 2 ice cubes a week, but let's face it, we want to try to replicate the natural environment of that plant. And a Phalaenopsis growing in a tropical rainforest of Southeast Asia has no idea what freezing cold water is on its roots. Okay, that's not the furthest thing from nature. So then light. Okay, after water, next most critical and variable and most often question we have here is how much light do I give my orchid? And this all depends first, again, on what type of orchid you have. But yet for our conversation today, Phalaenopsis are considered low light orchids. Cattleyas are considered high light orchids. For a Phalaenopsis, textbooks will often recommend an east-facing window or a filtered south or west window. And the logic here is that an east window gets a little bit of direct sun before that sun is too intense or hot. And then the rest of the day, it's a bright indirect light, okay? Now a Cattleya can handle a much more sunny window with several hours of direct sun, but even it has its limits. You know, sitting outside on a picnic table in July in Miami, it's gonna sunburn within 24 hours and you'll probably kill that orchid. But yet sitting in a sunny window in January in Washington, DC, that's a whole different world of intensity, and it could take several hours of direct sun. Here at Hillwood, you can see here on the left here, this is part of our Cattleya collection. Lots of bright sunlight, direct rays coming in on this during the winter time, but yet our Phalaenopsis are on the other side of this bench, which is a bench that faces north, no direct sun, and then we even have this extra shade cloth material up here in order to prevent any direct rays from getting there. So for here at Hillwood, Phalaenopsis, darkest area of the greenhouse, Cattleyas, one of the most sunny and bright areas of the greenhouse, okay? So here, this is a kitchen window that I have in my kitchen, a little kitchen garden window. You can see a very, very faint shadow, okay? If you have a faint shadow, that's a good sign of low light, okay? So this would be a prime place for a Phalaenopsis orchid, as opposed to this generic photo off the internet. Look at those direct rays coming in. This would be the window you would grow your Cattleyas in. This would be the window to put your Phalaenopsis in. And I wish I could tell you more about artificial light. Many growers grow by artificial light. I've always been a windowsill grower. Whole nother world of growing orchids. I would certainly recommend though to keep that, to try to replicate the natural day length inside too, so that it's not 12 hours of light year round, you know, so you fluctuate that light. So, you know, lastly, you know, it's this windowsill, you know, even though it's hard to recommend the best window, it's often once people find the best window in their home and that provides all these correct environmental cues, you know, these are the people that often say, oh, it's so easy, I don't do anything and my orchid blooms every year. Well, I would argue most of that is because they have found the perfect window in their house that allows that orchid to know exactly where on that annual cycle it should be. Okay, so if you've had an orchid for more than a year and it hasn't bloomed, move it to a spot with more light. And then temperature. This is our last big cultural requirement that we're going to talk about. Both Phalaenopsis and Cattleyas are considered warm-loving orchids. And this implies that during the winter time, they should be maintained in the 60-degree range, okay? So which corresponds to our homes. But yet, here's the biggest tip of the day, folks. In order to get your orchid to bloom, one of the easiest tricks out there and the way that we rely on the most here at Hillwood is that in the fall months, as temperatures outside naturally begin to dip a little bit, we intentionally will allow cooler air to come in to our greenhouses. We intentionally turn the thermostat down about 10 degrees. So I lied there. Rather than the mid 60s as a minimum, during the months of September and October, we might turn the thermostat down to 52. And we let all that cool air come in, right? And what's that doing is that's allowing that plant to realize, okay, conditions are changing. Now, not only is it getting chillier at night, I'm experiencing less and less hours of daylight, right? And then at the same time, that's when we will start restricting watering or spreading out our watering a little bit, okay? So that's fall chill tells that plant, hey, it's time to harden off my growth for that year and maybe rest for a bit, and maybe it's time for me to flower, okay? But remember, again, it's not just that temperature, it's also daylight, watering, it's all these environmental cues working together. So again, if you had a Phalaenopsis or an orchid for more than a year, it hasn't bloomed, certainly, besides giving it a window with more light, try this fall chill. at home, can you just simply crack your window in September and October? You don't want to crack your window in January and February and let 20-degree air in. You want 40 and 50-degree air to come in around that plant, okay? And then lastly, Phalaenopsis are the easiest to trick and don't require being summered outside, but yet many orchid enthusiasts, and myself included, we put our orchids outside during the summertime because that's basically recreating a tropical rainforest. It's almost like a greenhouse outside. So your plants experience not only all these differences in day and night temperature, which is beneficial, they also get this change in temperature over the course of an entire season. And often that helps trigger them to bloom. We often hear these same people that say their orchids just bloom and they don't really have to do anything. Well, they often describe a scenario similar to this picture here, where they are growing in maybe what's a 3 or 4 season room, where it's a room that's filled with windows and that naturally at night drops down really a little bit cooler because of all those windows, but yet during the day, all that sunlight really warms up that room. So that's another really good indicator. They want those differences in temperatures. Avoid 72 degrees year round, and then avoid heater, air conditioner drafts, avoid cold drafts from the door opening, and again, and avoid transporting on extra hot or extra cold days. So our next little culture requirement is humidity and the closely related air movement. These are pretty simple concepts. In general, orchids prefer higher humidity levels than what is naturally found in our homes. So misting plants, you can mist all day. Like misting plants is great. What's even better here is making a humidity tray. This is a manufactured one, but the idea here is that you fill this bottom reservoir with water. You put the grate on, you put all your plants on top of the grate, and then as that water evaporates, it kind of makes this little slightly more humid environment right up around those plants, okay? And then another great way to increase humidity is simply just grouping all of your plants closely together. And that's what I was partly doing here in my kitchen window. That was part of my logic here, but the other part was, of course, putting as many plants in there, making it impossible for my little kitty to get back into the window. But of course, as we all know, kitties are pretty sneaky little animals, and they ultimately get their way. So that's how my garden window used to be when I first got it. And now, of course, this is what the garden window looks like now. So if you have a cat and an orchid collection and you want to get an orchid window, make sure that orchid window is big enough for everybody. Okay, it's my piece of advice. But here is a homemade humidity tray here, and 1-inch plastic saucer about 1 inch deep, filled with gravel. You pour water into that gravel, but yet the pots there are resting above that water level. You never want the pots to sit in water. And then lastly, air movement. That's really important for us in the greenhouse. In the home, it's not necessary unless you have a large collection. In fact, it actually lowers the humidity. So I would not recommend a fan or air movement for the general home gardener. And then fertilizer, right? So most tropical orchids, right, we talked about their epiphytes. Well, epiphytes are growing up in a tree. You're naturally a low feed plant, right? So they're considered to be light feeders, but yet they should be fed, right? We want them to bloom. Giving them fertilizer is going to help them bloom. But yet this should be reserved for periods where there's active growth, right? I think we're starting to put this together now that, at times when we see new roots or new leaves or new pseudobulbs forming, that's the perfect time to increase your watering and increase your fertilizer, right? This is happening during the warmer months of the year, right? As opposed to the colder months of the year where we're watering less because there's less heat and less light, well, we're going to fertilize less, okay? Technique is important again. I always take my plants to the sink. I water first. You never want to pour fertilizer water or solution on top of dry plants. So I water first. I let them sit there for a few minutes. And then I pour my solution of fertilizer mix on top of everybody. If you're purchasing an orchid fertilizer that's marketed as an orchid fertilizer like these are, just follow the directions. They're all okay. But since they're very weak solutions, please be careful if you're using a non-orchid fertilizer. You can easily burn orchids, or you can overdo it pretty easily. They're often sold in pairs. Here's one. This would be the standard. You know, all orchid or all fertilizers have an analysis, which are these 3 numbers. You can see these numbers are fairly balanced, whereas this one here has a huge middle number. The huge middle number is often called a bloom plus, or a blooming fertilizer, whereas this standard one is a you know, your average everyday growth. I have at home, I use these little tiny bottles that lasted me for years. You don't need a lot, but my standard one is 786. So again, fairly you know, even numbers, balanced numbers. And then my other one's 312.6, which I'll occasionally use when I know those plants might be starting to think about blooming towards the end of the summer. I might start mixing in a little bit of my Bloom Plus, but generally an orchid fertilizer, they're all basically about the same. Here at Hillwood, we are fertilizing actively during the warm months of the year. And then quite often we might go a month or 2 without any fertilizer during the depths of winter. And then we strategically choose which plants based on their native habitat, which ones we're going to fertilize. So cattleyas are certainly ones, because they do kind of have a slight winter dormancy there after that fall chill. It's certainly one to restrict fertilizing on. But a Phalaenopsis, it's always growing a little bit. So maybe, you know, during the summer, you're fertilizing it a couple times a month, and the winter, you're fertilizing it once a month. And then our last cultural requirement here to discuss today is the media selection. And there are hundreds of options to choose from, but yet all of the medias here on this page, what they have in common, right, is they're replicating that epiphytic nature, and they're allowing for good air and drainage around the roots, okay? So at Hillwood, we use orchiata bark, but yet the most common here is fir bark. This is what, you know, again, it's kind of like fertilizer. If it's a potting media that is represented or marketed for orchids, you're safe. But I would not use mulch out of, you know, hardwood mulch out of for your yard or anything. I would definitely use an orchid paste bark. But again, you're welcome to, you know, most of your orchids coming from the Phalaenopsis from the grocery store growing in sphagnum moss. You are more than welcome to replant into fresh sphagnum moss. Here at Hillwood, we transfer those over to a bark-based media. That's because I've always been an orchid grower, that I grow in bark. Andrew, he grows in bark. We both inherited a collection here at Hillwood where the previous growers were bark growers, and we use sphagnum moss very sparingly. But again, thousands of different opinions on which media to use. The idea is to keep that media fresh, keep it airy and light with really good drainage. And then lastly, just a moment here, all about repotting, you know, why, when, and how. I think we all know why now, right? We're repotting because we need to maintain that light, airy media that drains well. When? Well, we would want to do this just when new growth starts. So that happens late spring, right? At the beginning of the warmer months, right? So when we see a new leaf coming on our Phalaenopsis or on sympodial growth, this is what a new lead will eventually, this will turn into a pseudobulb or a cane here eventually, right? Perfect windows of opportunity, right? Right when it's starting to actively grow, because very shortly, these roots here were from last year's growth. This growth has to come out about 2 or 3 inches, and then it will start putting out its roots, right? So the absolute ideal time and moment in time is if you have a new root that's about a ½ inch long. That is your window, because you know then that root is going to keep growing, and it'll have its best chances of rooting down into your new media. If you get it there in that little window of late spring, early summer. And then how, you know, I recommend if you are purchasing a bark-based mixture from a big box store or wherever, you soak that bark overnight for about 12 hours to help pre-moisten it. It's very dry at first. And then you can even, moments before you're going to repot, you can soak your orchid in a warm bath of water for about 5 or 10 minutes, and that helps soften up the roots, makes them a little bit more flexible. And then basically you pull that plant out of the pot, you take away all that old media that's starting to break down. You can take your scissors and trim any brown mushy roots. And then often you're putting that plant right back into that same size pot, and then just filling back in with fresh, chunky media, right? Recreating that epiphytic nature. So our talk next Thursday at 1:30 is all about repotting, and we'll do some live examples of repotting right in front of the camera. So I definitely invite you to come join us next week. And then our kind of almost done here, our slide here shows us, pests and disease. We could have a whole talk just about pests and disease. But here off to the left are the three biggest pests in Hillwood's greenhouses. This is thrips, scale, and mealybug. And we spend a tremendous amount of time, especially our volunteers. We have a tremendous volunteer group that helps us with our orchid collection. And if you just have a few pests at home, take Q-tips, dip them into rubbing alcohol, and then literally use that to just swipe those insects right off that plant. Here at Hillwood, our greenhouses are going organic. We're about 99% there. So we no longer use traditional pesticides, and instead we rely very heavily on releasing beneficial insects in the greenhouse. And this here is a little tiny parasitic wasp. Here's a little mite that he's a good mite that eats bad mites. Here's a little lacewing larva, and here's a little minute pirate bug. And we order these in little bottles like this. And we literally shake them out into the greenhouse. And here is, they all come in these bottles in some type of carrier. So this is either rice hulls or cocoa shell hulls. And all the little baby insects are mixed into there. And they will spend their whole life coming out of there, walking across all the plants in search of these bad insects here off to the side. And they'll eat them up for us. So great place to look at is Arbico Organics. You as a homeowner can order from them. A great source to get started. And generally would not recommend the ladybug, which is, you often see that at the visitor or at like a garden center. The second you release ladybugs, they put a big smile on their face and they fly away free. They're free. So many other insects that are better, specific predators for specific insects. And then we still have a small arsenal of organic products. We use a lot of horticultural oil, and we really like this big time exterminator, which is an all organic type product. And so our last slide here, again, it's all about getting your orchid onto this annual cycle, providing those proper environmental cues over the course of an entire year by shifting those environmental conditions. And then, so, if you have a plant that hasn't bloomed, are you watering and fertilizing regularly during periods of active growth, and then are you providing maybe a little bit of a drier and a cooler rest period? Or, for some orchids, are you providing their strict dormancy where they get no water, right? Maybe you can try summering your plants outside, right? A little dappled shade spot so they get all those lovely tropical conditions that is around here in Washington, D.C. during the summertime. And then while they're outside, they're also getting that nice chill in the fall, right? So that then when you bring them in, they're yet in another new environmental conditions, right? Where it's cooler, drier, but bright. If you don't summer them outside, can you crack your window, or can you grow them in a room in your house where you can turn the heater vent off, so that it'll be a naturally cooler room, but yet still has nice bright sunlight, right? So many different things to do. But if your plant is not blooming, by all means, change its location to a sunnier spot or give it that fall chill. And that is all I have for you folks today. So thank you for joining us. And now we have time for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Drew. That recap at the end really touched upon a lot of the questions that I've been jotting down from the chat box that I know you've covered, but I want to run through them really quickly just to make sure that folks heard the answers. You just recapped that putting your plant outside under a covered porch or in dabbled light is a great idea. You talked earlier about how fertilizing, you aim for about once a week during those warm months and then less at other times. One question that came in was about how long you should expect the blooms to stay on a plant. How long should we expect those to last?
Aaron, that all depends on which type of plant it is. Some orchids but generally we're happy here at Hillwood. Like if our Cattleyas lasts for 2 to 3 weeks, that's a long time for Cattleya. individual flower, but yet a Phalaenopsis is in bloom for 2 or 3 months easily. So, and especially a big old Phalaenopsis can be in bloom for 6 months. So it all depends. So when you first buy your orchid, I would not expect it, you know, that thing's been traumatized. It's been shipped around the world. It's been in your car. It's been at the big box store. So often those don't last as long, but once people find that right spot in their home and actually have it come up and bloom from the get-go, and there's not traumatic experiences and fluctuations in environment, then those, particularly the Phalaenopsis, easily 3 or 4 months.
That's great. That's great. Now we get into the questions that I think are a little bit trickier, perhaps only because of my complete lack of orchid growing experience. Melissa asked early on whether her humidifiers would be helpful for an apartment in the winter. And I know you talked a little bit about those humidity trays.
Yeah, humidifier would be great too. Yeah, you want to, the homes in winter are particularly dry. So misting, humidifier, humidity tray, anything that's going to raise the ambient temperature or the ambient humidity around those plants is amazing. Yeah, definitely going to benefit.
I know some of these are also hinting at questions that we'll get into a lot more next week with our repotting class, but I've got a couple of questions about roots that might be wrapped around clay pots that they're hoping to reuse, or how to deal with those tangled roots in a way that won't hurt the plants.
Yes, yes. No, that's a tricky question. And a lot of it is being gentle, but yet you rip roots during repotting. The repotting experience is traumatic. So timing it right when there's new fresh roots coming is one way to help acclimate that or lessen that traumatic experience. But also soaking that plant in warm water for 10 minutes will make the roots much more pliable. And often I recommend, you know, the related question to this is what to do with all those roots that are growing out in the air. And often we recommend, if as long as you have some roots that go into the pot that help anchor the pot so that the plant doesn't rock and fall out, normally we leave those aerial roots out in the air again. But the toughest ones are the ones that have gripped onto the side of a clay pot. And it's virtually impossible to not damage those in the process of repotting, which is why, you know, every 2 to 3 years in the spring, you know, you set your plant back a little bit, but yet it's necessary for the long-term health of your plants. And plastic pots actually are a little easier. They don't grip on as much as clay. So that's another alternative way to go.
That's great. Nancy just asked a question about a currently blooming Phalaenopsis and when she should look to repot, whether that's after all the blooms have fallen off or at another time.
That's a great question. Yeah, you know, we want to enjoy their blooms, right? So we recommend to not replant while your orchid is in bloom. If there's one plant that would tolerate it, it would be the Phalaenopsis because they're the toughest and easiest. But no, I would wait. So Phalaenopsis, since they're always growing a little bit, they have most of their growth of leaves and roots in the warmer months of the year. So if it's blooming now, you could easily wait till June, you know, and then maybe in June it's time, even if it still had 1 or 2 little flowers, maybe it's time just to cut that bloom stalk off, repot it, and get that plant reinvigorated into its fresh media so it can put all its energy into those roots rather than trying to do one more little bloom if it's been blooming for 3 or 4 months. And then, you know, it's always better to get a fresh spike to come up the following year as opposed to keep letting this little guy bloom 1 flower at a time.
Excellent. I think that also answers. Gail sent a question earlier in about if green stakes were missing, will new ones grow in? And in fact, that is the hope, right? That you want to get rid of those stalks once they finish blooming.
Yeah, you know, there's all different types of ways. Phalaenopsis are the exception that you can, you know, what we do is literally ours keep blooming little by little all through the summer. And eventually we say enough's enough. And by midsummer, we end up cutting all of ours, even if there are a couple blooms, because again, we want to put that energy back into the plant. But yes, when you're done, I just recommend to cut the stalk here. Books will say that you can cut up here where the first flower fell off, but that takes a lot of energy for that plant to put. Sometimes it'll put out a little secondary little spray. But that takes multiple months, and that's the same time that all that energy could be going to, grow healthy roots and leaves and such.
We also got a question about if there's a particular technique or any tips for cutting off that bloom stock, or if it's as simple as just grabbing your kitchen scissors.
Yeah, at home, I grab my kitchen scissors. Here, and just literally snip. But here at Hillwood, we have such a large collection. Virus is a bit of a concern, so we sterilize between every single cut from one orchid to the next, because any juices that could be on those pruning scissors may infect a virus and transfer it to another. But a homeowner with a few orchids, you're not worrying about viruses. So yeah, you just cut it or use a knife, whatever you do to get a nice clean cut.
So now we start to get into the questions that I think are a little bit trickier, and part of why we really rely on your expertise, Drew. The first Kathy Durden asked is if you have a great reference book on orchids, something to help those of us who are new orchid growers know a little bit about what the ideal temperature and watering needs are for each variety.
Great question. There's hundreds of books out there, but honestly, I think I would save money and I would go online to the American Orchid Society and talk about, they're old school. They tell you just how it is. And I really, really like how simple they speak and tell you about all the different basic orchids. So yeah, American Orchid Society, and they have what they call their little culture sheets, I think, but endless amounts of information there. And it's great.
And those are really great because those culture sheets are generally a two-sided one-pager that is just everything you need to know about your plant. So if you, like me, have one Phalaenopsis in your kitchen window, that's all you need.
It really is. They give you just the pure basics without all this other random stuff. So yeah, American Orchid Society.
Deepuka, and I'm sorry, I hope that I'm pronouncing everyone's names correctly, but Deepuka asked how to help triage plants when we notice orchids starting to show those signs of traumas. They just moved, and unfortunately moved as orchids were starting to bud. So now they are in a very sad state. Any recommendations on what to do with yellowing leaves or other things to help those plants thrive? And
yeah, that's a complicated question. That is a tricky question there, Erin. So yeah, I guess I would have a lot of follow-up questions to see, did they change drastically the environment they're in? Like, were they living in California and now they're in Washington, D.C., right? Like, that's a very drastic change. Yellowing leaves, I can even see on this Phalaenopsis, this bottom one is starting to turn yellow, right? It's natural one at a time for the bottom leaves to come out. So I would say, okay, what's your new growth look like? Does your new growth look good? If it was in the middle of blooming, that's putting a lot of extra energy on the plant too. So it must have been happy enough to bloom. So, I guess it's a hard question to answer without seeing the plant or the specifics. But, the worst thing to have happen to a Phalaenopsis, in my opinion, is if the growing point turns brown and mushy, it's almost a done deal. Like it's time to just throw it in the trash. If your crown rots, or the same with a monopodial orchid with like a cattleya here, you can see look how crazy that thing's growing. So, but yet if the new growth that came out and you had a baby little pseudobulb and it turned black, like when it was only a couple inches tall, like if your brand new growth turns black, mushy, then it's a really bad sign. So, but otherwise, most orchids, I would tell her, hey, maybe have you not repotted in 3 years? Maybe this spring's the time to repot. Do you have a sunny or a shady porch that you could put your orchids out into? That always helps revive things, is the summer warmth and shade. So many ways.
In tackling pests and diseases, Rhonda asked, when you use that rubbing alcohol, does that kill the bugs, or should she be looking on the floor to make sure that anything that escaped is actually dead and not going to come back onto the plant?
Good question. that rubbing alcohol just kind of desiccates the skin. But a lot of those insects like mealybug and scale, the mother is there and she's like a little disc and her little babies are up underneath her. So this is why if you just spray with a pesticide or even just spray with rubbing alcohol, you might kill that mother, but all those little babies are underneath her perfectly protected. So the little Q-tip does the swipe where you're removing mama and babies. And then yes, normally I've never worried about them falling on the floor. I think they're stuck on that Q-tip, but yeah, I would probably put some paper towels down or something so that, yeah, anybody that did fall off. And that's not a one-time treatment. That's something that every time you would water, if you did have a pest like a mealybug or scale, those things love down in the nooks and crannies, way down in here. So you will not see them at all times. So every time you water, get a good quick visual analysis down in those the little cracks and crannies, and then get your rubbing alcohol in there. But yeah, I think that answers.
That's good. That's great.
Okay.
Beverly joined us last week for the greenhouse tour where kikis came up.
Yes.
And you talked about how kikis are a sign that your plant is not very happy. So Beverly is wondering what she can do to keep her orchid happier and asks what she should do with that kiki.
Well, I'll go back. That's sometimes a sign that your plant is struggling for one reason or another. So it makes a little baby as a way to help propagate itself. So that's kind of the logic of why it would make a baby. But yet there are certain other plants that are just really prone to kikiing. There are certain Phalaenopsis that I think, once that plant starts making kikis, it's a kiki maker. So, the trick with it, so a kiki is when instead of where a little flower bud would form, a baby little plant just like this starts forming and a little leaf pops out rather than a flower bud. And then first it'll be just one little leaf and then a second little leaf and then a third little leaf and then you'll see a little root. So you end up with this little tiny baby version of a plant up here with little roots dangling. So what you would want to do is once those roots, I would wait until it actually, if you wanted to propagate it, now you can just cut that stalk off and throw the little kiki in the trash and keep back to your mother plant because that little kiki is robbing energy from your mother plant. So that's one option. Or you wait till that kiki maybe gets, a root or two that's an inch long, and then you can literally cut that kiki off and then put him in his own little pot. And he'll be one that definitely, those kikis, those roots have always been in the air. And the more air the roots are in, the more tough they are. So if you have a kiki with 5 or 6 inch long roots, those might be hard to fit into a pot. So I think that's where the kiki scenario comes a little bit more tricky, is how do you actually get the kiki off the bloom stalk and into a pot without damaging those few roots. So it's probably the same timing. Spring, when we know it's starting to actively grow a little bit more, pre-moistening that soil, pre-moistening the roots so they're a little bit more flexible, putting them in a small little pot at first, and then gradually growing them out.
We have one more question on yellowing leaves and veining leaves. And for leaves that start getting veined, is there something different than you mentioned? The lower leaves do tend to turn yellow and fall off. What would you recommend?
Well, if we're talking about a Phalaenopsis here, I assume we're talking about a Phalaenopsis. A lot of Phalaenopsis, if the veining is turning purple or red, so I'm not exactly sure I'm picturing it right, that question, but even this guy has some purple coloration closer, and that's often a sign of either that it actually has purple flowers. You'll see some purple coloration come out, but it's also a sign that it's getting a high degree of light when you start seeing a little bit of purple venation and coloration. Now, if it's a yellow and more of a chlorotic looking thing, again, it's pretty natural. Like orchids, they are tough little buggers, but yet those leaves, they're not very plentiful leaves and they last for a long time, and their leaves can sometimes just be kind of ratty and ugly. So, if I'm thinking if it's yellow, would I say, okay, yellow could be from not enough fertilizer. It could be a sign of a root problem because for some reason or another, water is not getting up into the plant, and that could be from overwatering or underwatering, right? If your plant's limp and not nice, like this is a nice perky little plant here. But if your plants are slightly wrinkled or limp, then that, again, root problem. But the issue with orchids and many of our house plants is that signs of overwatering often look very similar to signs of underwatering. And it's because the root system is not able to push up moisture into those leaves. So without seeing the plant, but yellowing plants, yeah, nutrient deficiency, I don't think it doesn't sound like a disease necessarily. So I would try, first, if you've never fertilized it, give them some fertilizer. If you haven't repotted for a few years, repot the orchid, it's all, so many different ways to do it, Erin.
If for those yellow leaves, should folks remove those or let them be, or just kind of?
If it's the natural leaf at the very bottom or the very bottom couple of leaves, yes, you can naturally remove those as they go. If it's the crown, bad sign. If it's coming out of your brand new leaf, and then the issue is if you have a bad spot on your leaf and if you cut your leaf, we all know what happens is that then you get a brown slice there and then that death just moves back in. So at a certain point, like I can't look, if my home collection, I'm not going to look at an ugly leaf. I'm probably going to be one that cuts it, right? Because but yet you have to make those decisions yourself. A lot of times it could even have been just physical damage. Could that have been caused by somebody breaking it? Like I just see here, there's a big crack on this leaf with brown spots, and that's probably from somebody bumping it into it. So many different reasons why a leaf might not look so good. One thing that should know, if your plant is healthy, on a Phalaenopsis, until that plant's mature, which most are not mature when you first buy them, each new leaf should progressively get larger than the leaf that was before. So if you've had several leaves come out and each of your leaves are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, that plant's in trouble. It's the same with the Cattleya. Each pseudobulb, as you get a new growth, should get bigger and bigger and bigger until it reaches its mature size. But most of our plants are not mature plants yet. So we always want bigger and better, or if not, there is a sign that something is wrong in one of those cultural conditions.
And I saved the last question, the best question for last, because it seems like a very good uplifting note to end on. Someone shared that whenever their Phalaenopsis blooms, they tend to think that they've done a pretty good job on the cycle, and wondered if that is indeed the right way to assess your care. And yeah. I see from your great big grin that,
I mean, you get it to bloom. That's the whole point, right? And when we hold this workshop in person, I always go around the room and ask people, and I flush out the people where blooming a Phalaenopsis is easy. And I always like to hear their contributions, and they can contradict me, but often that's where they talk about this beautiful bright window and they water it once a week, and they'll even make claims like they haven't repotted it for 8 years, so it's all about finding that proper window space and getting it onto the cycle. And it's easy once you get that rhythm down, but it's all about finding that rhythm. It's a little tricky.
Well, Drew, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. And again, invite those of you who are in the DC area to come and admire Drew's hard work in the greenhouses. They are absolutely stunning right now. And I hope that everyone will join us next Thursday at 1:30 for a demonstration of orchid repotting and our last little virtual celebration for Orchid Month. And we'll hope that next year we'll see some of you in person too. Thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.